Good morning and good afternoon to those in Europe who are listening today to our panel entitled Gazprom versus Moldova, a company versus a state. That title tells us all about Gazprom's modus operandi, acting as the long hand of the Kremlin to implement Kremlin's geopolitical goals in its neighborhood and further in Europe. As Gazprom was reducing supplies to Europe to exert pressure on Germany and the European Union to certify its new mega pipeline Nord Stream 2, Moldova had to declare a state of emergency when the Russian energy giant reduced supplies to the country in an attempt to extort Moldova and to press it to sign a new contract for gas with very unfavorable prices. The state-owned Russian gas giant acted as the Kremlin's at the Kremlin's behest to destabilize Moldova's new Western-oriented authorities and extract political concessions from them. The gas supply agreement signed on October 29 are a temporary solution on Russian terms, preserving Gazprom's monopoly. Coordinated with it, Russia's state-owned conglomerate, Inter-RAO, it's a quasi-monopoly that is holding control over Moldova's electricity supplies from the Transnistrian plant operating with Gazprom gas. The artificially induced supply crisis exemplifies Russia's use of its dominant position in energy supply and transportation as instruments of power politics. We have an excellent panel today with three experts who are going to discuss what is happening with Moldova, what are the lessons for Europe from the crisis in Moldova. I'm Margarita Asenova, I'm a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, and I'm pleased to introduce Sergiu Tofilat, who served as Moldovan President Maia Sandu's advisor on energy policies until May of this year. Frank Umbach, who is a research director of the European Cluster for Climate, Energy and Resource Security, Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn, and Vladimir Sokor, senior fellow of the Washington-based Jamestown Foundation and its flagship publication, Eurasia Daily Monitor. I would like to start the panel with Sergiu Tofilat. Please, Sergiu, tell us what happened in Moldova.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining this event. Let's go through the events that took place during the last 2 months, just to have to share our experience how is to deal with the Gazprom and the Kremlin administration. On September 30, just 1.5 months ago, our midterm contract with Gazprom was expiring. There was a proposal to extend this contract for another couple of years. This proposal was submitted by the government, and there was no sign that Gazprom is willing to change the approach. However, they didn't react until the last day of the contract. Then Gazprom just switched us to very high spot prices, given the market situation currently in Europe and Asia, and extended the contract for 1 month to have some negotiations. So Gazprom officials were trying to convince us that this was a purely commercial approach. But was it? Let's analyze the facts and make conclusions for everyone. So we had a midterm contract, let's say, beginning with 2007. The price was set every quarter, and it was linked to petrol market and average long-term contracts on gas supply for Europe. So Moldova was fully paying the average European gas price. This contract was constantly extended for 1 year, for 3 years. The last time it was extended 1 year ago in 2020. And at that time, Gazprom didn't ask any questions about the gas debt, about changing the formula. The simple reason is because 1 year ago, the parliamentary majority was controlled by the pro-Russian socialists. So at that time, 1 year ago, Gazprom had no questions. This time, we had presidential elections in November 2020, won by a pro-Western politician. This year in July, we also had parliamentary elections won by a pro-European party. So Gazprom lost, Moscow lost its influence in Moldova, and they have no friends here. That's why Russia tried to put some conditions maybe to improve their situation. So Gazprom switched us to spot prices, which were actually 4 times higher than the price that was to be set by the previous formula. So in October, we paid $790 for the gas. Then Gazprom simply cut the gas supply by 1/3. We are speaking about 26 million cubic meters for October. Just to have an idea, Gazprom's exports to European market account for as much as 180 billion cubic meters, and they didn't find 26 million cubic meters for Moldova. So it's something like 0.02% of their exports to Europe. So it's nothing for them, but very, very important for us. And the government was like forced to buy small volumes on European market. Romania, Ukraine helped us with some gas supply to keep the pressure in the pipelines. And one additional condition was that Russia requested us, or Gazprom requested us, to repay the so-called gas debt of the right bank of Moldova. Just a quick reminder, the overall debt to Gazprom, this is a commercial one between Moldova Gas and Gazprom. So Moldova Gas has to pay a debt of nearly $8 billion, out of which 700 million are likely to be the debt of the right side of the Republic of Moldova, and 7.3 billion, it's the debt of the breakaway Transnistrian region. So Gazprom requested Moldova to repay its pretended debt, 700 million, not saying a word about the Transnistrian debt, which is 10 times higher. So if we speak about a commercial approach, why it's a different approach towards Transnistria. At the same time, we faced a decrease of electricity output by the power plant located in Transnistria, by Moldgres, which is also operated by a Russian holding, Inter-RAO. So this forced us to rely on inflows of electricity from Ukraine, which is also twice more expensive. So another crisis was related on the electricity sector. So our government was in a quite difficult situation. At the same time, knowing the background, knowing the situation, me and my colleagues, we thought that having a deal, a contract with Gazprom might be the main scenario. This is simply because Moscow has no other way how to supply gas to Transnistria. And actually, these supplies of gas on credit, let's say as so, because Transnistria never paid its gas bills. This supply of gas on credit is a way of funding this separatist regime. So actually, in this area, Gazprom is acting like a branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. It constantly provides gas for years to Transnistria, but not directly. Because the contracts with the left bank, with the breakaway region, are signed by Moldova Gas, which is the majority controlled by Gazprom. Actually, in this very difficult situation, the government relied on some small acquisitions of gas on spot market just to keep the pressure in the pipelines. In order to avoid some consumers to be disconnected, and negotiations continued in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Russia tried to put some political conditionalities. We just may speculate on that because obviously nothing was put on paper, but we've seen a number of statements and some articles published on that. It refers to the status of the Russian army located in Transnistria, about Moldova to give up on the association agreement with the EU, some other conditionalities related to that. But officially, there is obviously nothing put on paper. Anyway, the government refused to discuss such political conditions and insisted on having purely a commercial discussion. This is mainly due to the fact that currently Moldova is in a much better situation concerning the gas supply routes than it was like until 2019. So now we can deliver gas from any sources. We have 4 different entry points, and we have a slightly bigger leverage of negotiation. However, the problem still relies on the electricity side. Just a quick review here. We produce less than 20% of our consumption internally, while the other 80% is imported from Ukraine or acquired from the power plant in Transnistria, which operates on Russian gas and builds up our gas debt. Moreover, 4 out of 5 power lines that interconnect us with Ukraine are tied up with the substation of that power plant in Transnistria. So basically, Moldova is still very vulnerable when it comes to electricity supplies. That's why within the next 3 to 4 years, we have to build additional infrastructure, power lines to interconnect with the Romanian market and to cut off this dependence on Russian gas and power plant that operates in Transnistria. A few words about the so-called gas debt. So Gazprom pretends that we have a gas debt of $700 million. However, according to our assumptions, we published a research on this issue 1 year ago. It is called Moldova versus Gazprom, who actually owns debts, who actually has debts. So according to our estimations, this debt of the right bank was artificially increased by more than $950 million due to illegal actions taken by Gazprom, when Gazprom used Moldova's assets to repay the debt of the left bank because of the abusive conditions of splitting the income from transit of gas, and mainly because of the embezzlement of funds from Moldova Gas. Actually, Gazprom, being the main shareholder of Moldova Gas, turned a blind eye on the corruption schemes that took place at Moldova Gas. They were not using the money paid by consumers to pay the gas bills to Gazprom, but rather the money was siphoned off to shell companies. This was used to corrupt the Moldovan political elites. So Gazprom was turning a blind eye on those schemes, while Moldovan authorities were preserving the scheme of gas supply to fund Transnistrian separatist regime by Gazprom and preserve the status quo and maintain actually Moldova in the sphere of influence of the Kremlin administration. Anyway, the deal was concluded at the end of November. The price formula was not disclosed. However, we've seen an article published by Russian news agency TASS. They pretend that from some inside information, the formula during winter period is, so the price refers to 70% linked to petrol market and 30% linked to spot prices of gas. And during summer, it's the vice versa. 70% is spot market and 30% it's petrol formula. There was signed kind of minutes of negotiations between Minister of Infrastructure Spânu and Gazprom. It refers to, I'll point just 2 important issues here. One refers to conduct an audit at Moldova Gas to see to what extent this debt is real. And the second thing is to postpone the unbundling at Moldova Gas until the debt issue is figured out definitely. So it might be for a couple of years. Some of the opinion makers here were scared by this formula. I mean, with the unbundling and the third energy package. But if we'll go into details, just a quick review. We have the legislation in place. So now Moldova Gas is obliged to provide third-party access to the pipelines to any other supplier. And the purpose of this third energy package to have a competitive market, to have lower prices for consumers. Well, obviously now there is no one to compete with Gazprom when it comes on prices. However, it might be the case during, for instance, the next summer. But we should take into account that during summer, Moldova's consumption of gas is about 15–20% from the whole annual volume. So the volumes are quite small, and I doubt that Moldova Gas will somehow prohibit someone to access the gas networks. There is no reason. Even though if there will be necessity, actually Moldovan government can decide upon by itself to name an independent operator of the pipelines without having the accept of Gazprom. But I think it won't be necessary. Okay, any crisis actually brings opportunities. So now we have to focus on taking some steps in order to avoid getting in the same situation in future. In the short period of time, we need to have some gas reserves. There are storages in Ukraine, Romania. We can create some reserves for at least 1 or 2 months of consumption during winter. And in the midterm, it's about construction of power lines to interconnect with the Romanian electricity market. And it's about implementing projects of energy efficiency. Mainly, it's about district heating in Chisinau and Belz. We have around 600,000 consumers, and the quality of district heating is very, very low. We inherited the Soviet old style second generation district heating, which doesn't allow to regulate the consumption in each apartment. So someone at the top levels is opening the window and heating the air outside, and someone from the lower floors is freezing. And there is always some conflict on that. So we need to upgrade the district heating, which is the main gas consumer. And we need to implement renewable energy projects. This is just a quick... and also, besides infrastructure, we need market rules to ensure that everyone follows the legislation. Thank you. Margarita, I just turned on your microphone.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, Sergio. So we're seeing here several problems, and you said how all of them are going to be addressed by the new government, which just turned 100 days, and the expectations are that a lot of problems are going to be solved by the new prime minister. One of them is the sources of gas. Apparently, the need for diversification. The other one is expanding the gas network to reach the northern part of the country, completing the compression station in Romania. Then the problem with the monopoly of Gazprom, pretty much holding 70% of Moldova gas, is a full control of the company, which I don't know whether the government is planning to change. And in addition to that, you talked about Inter-RAO, and which is a Russian state-owned company, and the hold on the electrical grid that is connected to Transnistria instead of other European countries, making Moldova more independent. And most importantly, for the government, something that the government can do is improving energy efficiency. Do you think that the government can work on changing the ownership of Moldova Gas, getting back the company to be under the state control instead of a foreign entity control?
Actually, this company was formed back in 1998. as a consequence of the fact that Transnistria was not paying the gas bills and all the debt was accumulated on state budget. So in a way to fix that problem, all the gas infrastructure on the left bank in Transnistria and in Moldova was put into the capital of Moldova Gas. So now all the gas debt that is accumulated by Transnistria, it's a purely commercial one. Until we don't fix the issue with gas debt accumulation, there is no reason to address the problem of Moldova Gas ownership, because it's risky to shift this debt to the budget. However, maybe it is even not very necessary to approach the ownership of Moldova Gas. We just have to make sure that it follows the third energy package and completely guarantees the third-party access to the grid. This is the most important one. So there are a couple of ways how to make unbundling, and ownership unbundling is maybe the hardest one, especially given the existing gas debt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will turn now to Mr. Frank Umbach, who is going to talk about the situation in Moldova in relation to the European Union and what are the lessons for the European Union. As I said, he's a research director of the European Center Cluster for Climate, Energy and Resource Security at the University of Bonn. He is also a consultant for NATO. He has given regular presentations at high-level NATO conferences and seminars. And previously, he served as an energy security consultant for the German Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense Policies, the European Commission and European Parliament, the United States State and Energy Department, and the Lithuanian government. Thank you very much, Mr. Umbach, for being with us today. Please tell us what is your take on the situation in Moldova in relation to the entire energy situation in the European Union. Thank you.
Let me firstly thank you for the kind invitation to the very interesting topic of today. What I will do, as Sergio has already, I think, perfectly introduced, the topic, particularly the latest development. I think there is, of course, a broader context, and I will rush a little bit through my slides, particularly the first ones, because Sergio has already introduced the topic. And of course, there is a context in a way that already before the July elections, the EU and Moldova have enhanced their relationship. Yeah, in June, the month before, they have announced an economic recovery plan worth of 700 million over the next 3 years. So already at that time, looking from a Moscow point of view, which is of course rather alarming, both the EU and Moldova have enhanced their relationship. In July, the clear victory has, of course, strengthened the position of the Reformist Party of Action Solidarity, together with the election of Maidu Sandu already of last November. So from a Moscow point of view, I think these developments have been, of course, looking more alarmistic. And the question is, of course, how Moscow would perceive those developments and whether it would use, as it has done so over the last 20 years, repeatedly, the energy dependence of various European countries and to maintain its geopolitical leverage. And here again, in the energy field, we have also seen that Moldova and the EU have strengthened their relationship, also with EU members and neighbors such as Romania and Ukraine, which Moldova wants to enhance their relationship, build new electricity and gas interconnectors, diversify its energy supplies. And that has led to the situation, as Sergio has already told us, leading to a new gas supply crisis after Gazprom refused to continue its gas supplies after the end of September, and in doing so, the Kremlin and Gazprom have threatened to stop those supplies unless Moldova accepts various Russian financial and political conditions. So at the first glance, as so often, when you're looking from a purely economic point of view, it looks like that the gas supply crisis appeared primarily just as a gas price conflict, quite similar to the interpretation of some economic experts still today when they will analyze the Russian-Ukrainian gas crisis in 2006. And of course, I belong to those who have from the very beginning, already before 2006, warned that Russia will use the energy dependencies for its geopolitical leverage. And I belonged even to those who have warned even before the very first Russian-Ukrainian gas conflict, when nobody wanted to hear that. Moldova, of course, was also seeking in September already an emergency support and supplies from the EU via Romania, Slovakia, and Ukraine, as Moldova gas did not maintain the pressure levels in the pipeline network. Moldova also concluded a trial purchase of 1 million cubic meters from a Polish PG&IG company, as well as from a Dutch one, as well as receiving 5 responses to a tender for alternative gas supplies. And that put certainly some kind of pressure also to Gazprom. But Gazprom, as we have heard, was largely in the position to maintain its leverage and also to push through its various conditions. And I guess Vladimir will just also going more in details. To put that background into the larger European one, I think we have on one hand global energy and gas supply crisis, which started actually at the end of 2020, also leading to very high gas price levels around the globe. So this is not something which is something of a special development just in Europe. So I would argue that originally the European gas supply crisis emerging in the early summer this year had originally nothing to do with Russia at first. There are various global developments here in place, which caused and had its impacts, leading to a European gas supply crisis. And what then happens is a very usual pattern we have seen in Russia's policies over the years, because it has used and exploited the already existing European gas crisis, which is a pattern which you could observe already before in various previous also foreign policy crises. When you think upon migration, Syria, Iraq, Libya, it was not so much that we had here a master strategy on the Russian side in place by causing these conflicts, but here again, in all of these cases, Russia was rather using and exploiting those already existing crises for weakening the political solidarity of the EU, as well as the political consensus on those issues when it comes to Russia, such as in Germany. So the use of, as I said, of energy and gas dependencies as a foreign policy tool can be even traced back to the so-called Farling Doctrine in 1991, when Russia had, for the very first time, to think upon very seriously after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, how to define a foreign policy to its previous federal Soviet republics. And the Falin doctrine, developed in the Central Committee Party of the Communist Party at that time still existing in Russia, was defined by Valentin Falin, who was a previous ambassador in Germany, and which emerged then one of the typical hardliners against Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And he published a paper which then became more or less the official foreign policy concept, in which he enumerated or pointing out 7 leverage Russia has. And at the very first point was actually using the energy dependencies of the former Soviet republics as well as of the previous Warsaw Pact members. And from that time, you get that. When you're looking to the European gas prices, you see here a slide which are highlighting to which extent the European gas prices have exploded until July. And you see also here, this was emerging before Russia partly came in. Yeah. So this is another proof that the original gas supply crisis in Europe started or was the direct result of the global gas supply crisis. But of course, when Russia exploited the situation and was withholding gas supplies in the summertime in July and August, which are normally the months when the gas storage, the European gas storage, including in Germany, are filled up, then of course the prices even exploded more, and leading, of course, also a lot of nervousness. When you want to analyze this proto picture, you need to take into account that for years the European domestic gas production has been constantly declined since 2010. Yeah, although the gas demand also originally after 2010 declined surprisingly, quite contrary to the forecast at around 2010, they have increased since 2014 again until the global pandemic was starting. Here again, the situation nonetheless has completely changed on the global and European market, because originally you could observe also the European gas market was something which experts described as a producer market, in which the producing country has the most leverage. But we had a global situation thanks to the US shale gas revolution, where prior to 2020, when the pandemic started, we had already a global oversupply of natural gas, which leading to a very drastic decline of the gas prices. And then the pandemic was hitting the world, and so the global energy and gas demand even further declined. And alongside also the natural gas prices declined in the first half of 2020 dramatically, which raised a lot of concern, of course, for the oil and gas producing countries, including on Russia, when you think upon that 80% of the state budgets or more are dependent on the exports of oil and gas, and so on returning the hard currency for the state budget. And against that background, there is another longer concern, which was particularly or increasingly puzzling the Russian leadership. And that is, of course, the overall European energy policies and the decarbonization, going away from fossil fuels, yeah, and to fasten the energy transition towards more and more renewables, which in return would not just decrease the coal consumption, but also over time would decrease the gas consumption. And if you look into the EU's Green Deal policies with a minus 55% emissions reduction target by the year 2030, then it becomes clear that the Commission was already forecasting that the European gas demand, not just coal, would decrease by the year 2030 and not just afterwards. And that was, of course, very alarming for the Russian side. You see here some figures which I put together, which highlights that also the fact that Russia has still strengthened, could strengthen its position until today. And what was striking for me was at the end of 2020, the Russian pipeline gas had a share of 46% of all Russian imports in the EU. So that has increased and not decreased what was the official EU policies. And in this figure, very often, what is not included is also the LNG share. Russia has increased its LNG exports to Europe too. Of course, there's still the policy in place that those LNG exports are only allowed to those EU countries which are not dependent on Russian Gazprom pipeline gas. So there is no LNG going directly today, which is also not possible to Germany because we don't have an own LNG import terminal until today, although that will change. But with this together, if you add the LNG share, then you came up as the official analysis of the European Commission concluded at the end of 2020 that the overall share pipeline and Russian LNG has even increased up to 53% of the overall EU natural gas imports. Meanwhile, the second quarter of 2021, when you look to the latest report, then you see it's also a little bit slightly lower. Yeah, but the figures still highlight the insufficiencies we have achieved in respect to our diversification efforts. For all the years, the EU Commission has pushed those policies. So let me just highlighting what I said before. When you take not just a short-term view, but also a longer-term view, you see here the mix of the EU's total primary energy demand as well as the EU's power capacity mix, as forecasted here by the International Energy Agency. And you see to which extent the share of natural gas will decline. Why I'm mentioning that, I will tell you in a minute. Here another industry view, which I think it's too optimistic. But anyways, those, of course, forecasts are even more alarming for the Russian side. Then you see that the EU fossil gas imports will decline from 301 million tons in the year 2019 to just less than 180 already by 2030. Again, my view is I'm not so optimistic, but I also believe that it will definitely decline. This is another slide just highlighting what I said before. One of the most important remaining gas fields in Europe had been for a long time the Groningen gas field in the Netherlands. And here it highlights the cap the Netherlands government put into for 2021, for this year as well as for the next year. So the Groningen field will, over the years, become ever less important and no longer provide significant domestic European gas coming from its own fields. So again, when you're looking to the exploitation strategy of Russia, you could see that Russia tried in August, beginning in August, by establishing various linkages and preconditions for a faster gas supply to European countries. So this was an official proposal coming from President Putin himself in interviews, as well as from Russian governmental representatives, by arguing we will be willing to supply faster gas supplies if the certification process for Nord Stream 2 will be fastened. And I think the expectation or the assumption behind that was clearly to fasten that kind of certification process as much as possible before a more critical German government could come into the government, which is still being negotiated. So we may have seen a new German coalition government by the end of the year, but it could also take a little bit longer. But given that the new coalition government is being formed not just by the Social Democratic Party, which is rather uncritical towards Russia, which has always from the beginning supported the Nord Stream pipeline. This is a party where Mr. Schröder comes from. So in this respect, it's no surprise. But the Green Party and the Liberal Democratic Party have been rather critical of the Nord Stream issue, and that has caused a lot of uncertainties on the Russian side. And therefore, fasten the certification provided a possibility for Russia that the regulation issues and controversies could be solved somehow in Russian favor, and so exploiting the already existing European gas supply crisis has given Russia, of course, a lot of ammunition for pushing through its demands.
Now, let's move to the next part, because we have only less than 20 minutes left, and then we'll return to questions, and some of the points that you put in your presentation you can use in the questions. Thank you so much. That was very, very useful. The crisis did start at the end of the winter last year, when there was a cold spike, and the traders started buying more gas. The prices went up. The LNG gas went to Asia. That usually happens when prices are better in Asia, and they are usually always better in Asia. But the factor that was not expected was that Russia was going to start reducing gas supplies to Europe. So the European gas market reacted like a stock market, went into a bit of a panic, and the price went up 4 or 5 times higher than it usually is. Vlad Sokor, I would like to turn to you to wrap up all the points and all the facts of Moldova's crisis. And let me just add one thing before you start. As Gazprom was denying Moldova 26 million cubic meters of gas to just fill the gap for a short period of time before they negotiate a contract, the Bulgarian government requested that Gazprom increases supplies to the country under the same contract and the same prices that they had in the current agreement. And that happened. It happened only 2 weeks before the presidential election to support the candidate that has been Russia friendly. So this is the big difference between Moldova and Bulgaria treatment by Gazprom. Thank you, Vlad, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margarita, and thanks to the preceding speakers. By way of wrapping this up, Moldova suffers from a unique set of energy vulnerabilities vis-à-vis Russia. Perhaps no other European country is as vulnerable to to Russia as Moldova is. It depends exclusively on the Russian monopoly Gazprom for natural gas, and it depends largely on the Russian electricity monopoly Inter-RAO UES for electricity supplied from a plant based in Transnistria, operating on Gazprom gas. So there is a coordination here between 2 Russian state monopolies, Gazprom and Inter-RAO UES. The latter, Inter-RAO UES, receives almost gratis Gazprom gas as a result of an agreement between Inter-RAO UES and the Transnistrian authorities, who themselves receive practically gratis gas from Gazprom. Moldova has no access to other gas supplies, none. It has no storage capacity. It is geographically located in a way in which Transnistria could, in an emergency, block electricity and gas supplies to the rest of Moldova. Gazprom controls, together with Transnistria, 63% of the shares of Moldova Gas. It has majorities on Moldova Gas Supervisory Board and Management Board. And the unbundling does depend, Moldova's unbundling does depend on Gazprom's consent with respect both to gas transmission pipelines and to gas distribution pipelines. No unbundling without Gazprom's consent. There is also the vulnerability arising from the indebtedness situation, as Sergiu Tofilat rightly pointed out. Moldova is not an important gas market for Gazprom. It is a very small market by Gazprom standards. Gazprom is serving as an instrument of Russia's political goals in Moldova. The political goals are, at the present time, to undermine Moldova's pro-Western government and to keep Transnistria supplied with gas and Transnistria's economy afloat. So this was not a price dispute between Moldova and Russia or between Moldova and Gazprom. The price manipulation served as a political instrument of coercion for Gazprom to achieve the Russian government's political goals in Moldova. One key participant in the negotiations over gas supplies was Dmitry Kozak, who plays two roles. He is the Russian co-chairman of the Russian-Moldovan Economic Intergovernmental Cooperation Commission, as well as Russia's chief negotiator on Transnistria. The Kremlin has placed both of these tracks into Kozak's hands in order to combine these two processes into the same hands and thereby enhance the negotiating leverage of Kozak by adding the energy leverage to the political leverage on Transnistria. The Moldovan government actually placed some hopes on Kozak's goodwill. During the entire crisis, the Moldovan presidential office and government were in contact by telephone with Kozak, hoping that he would intercede with Gazprom to facilitate an acceptable deal to Moldova. During there were 4 rounds of negotiations between Chisinau and Moscow, all 4 rounds held in Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. Kozak participated in 2 of those 4 rounds. And during the first round on October 7, Kozak introduced a number of political conditions into the negotiations over gas supplies. He did not hand a document. The conditions became known to Moldovan insiders from the notes taken by the Moldovan participants. And his conditions were for Chisinau to submit a concept, a general concept, in Russian, a videnie, a general concept, for the solution of the Transnistria conflict with the rapid integration of Transnistria into Moldova with a special status. Reopening the Tiraspol airport, former Soviet and Russian military airport currently closed, making some agreement with Moldova on a role for post-conflict military presence of Russia in Transnistria, to agree on the role, and to start trilateral discussions between Moldova, Moscow, and the European Union regarding, and here I quote, regarding the impact of Moldova's DCFTA agreement with the EU upon the Moldovan-Russian trade. The reports of Financial Times were somewhat exaggerated. Russia did not demand that Moldova exits from the DCFTA with the European Union, and that would have been totally out of character with Russia. That's not the Russian way. The Russian way is to ask for trilateral negotiations with a view to perhaps amending that agreement in line with Russian interests and throw an incentive to Moldova, because it is well known that the current Moldovan government, pro-Western though it undoubtedly is, does seek more trade with Russia and does seek more access to the Russian market for Moldovan agricultural products. So Kozak's intervention was extremely smart and dangerous. And then a week later, Kozak's office followed up with telephone calls to Chisinau, asking for Moldovan responses to this. Chisinau, to its credit, to its praise, never took up this bait. But it created the possibility for Kozak to throw this bait by seeking from the inception Kozak's intervention to facilitate a better deal for Moldova. I will return to this before the end of my presentation. Chisinau even invited Kozak to visit Moldova during the third week of October in the hope of getting a better deal on Russian gas. The success of Russia in these negotiations was not so much imposing a high price, which it did, but it was not the contract, was the protocol which accompanied the contract on gas supplies. There are two documents, the contract and the protocol. The accompanying protocol is a great success for Russia. And I'm surprised that Moldovan commentators, except for Sergiu here, with his exception, the Moldovan commentators did not pay much attention to this protocol. It's available only in Russian. One has to read the Russian text very closely. The protocol, first of all, the Moldovan government accepts some kind of responsibility for the right bank's debts to Gazprom. So this is a step in the direction of accepting Moldovan state responsibility for the debts as distinct from viewing it as a corporate responsibility of Moldova Gas. The unbundling is postponed until Moldova fully extinguishes the debt. The deadline would be 2027. And then they might talk about unbundling. They would talk about unbundling after 2027. Under the protocol, Moldova will have to propose to initiate, Moldova would have to initiate a proposal to create a joint commission and agreements between the Moldovan and Russian governments about long-term cooperation in the energy sector. And this will come as early as late November, when the Russian-Moldovan Intergovernmental Economic Cooperation Commission is scheduled to meet in Chisinau. So the Russian side is trying to create the impression that Moldova would initiate this sort of cooperation, which is, of course, not cooperation, but a continuation of the dependency. So the protocol creates the prerequisites for Moldova's continuing exclusive dependency on Gazprom. The protocol also creates the premise for Transnistria continuing to accumulate debts to Gazprom, albeit separately from the debts of the right bank. I always regarded Moscow's threats to Chisinau to make Chisinau responsible for Transnistria's gas debts as a bluff. No government in Chisinau, not even the socialists of Igor Dodon, would have accepted that, so that was a bluff on Moscow's part. But Moscow can raise this issue, hypothetically, in endgame negotiations over Transnistria conflict settlement and the terms of reintegrating Transnistria with Moldova. If we ever come to that stage, to the endgame, then Gazprom could throw this issue into the debate for leverage, for political leverage, of course. Now, why did Gazprom, or did the Kremlin task Gazprom, assign Gazprom to put these conditions at this time, because Moldova at this time has a pro-Western government. It is important to understand what do we mean by a pro-Western government in Moldova. This is widely misunderstood in the West. The new Moldovan authorities do not regard their election victory and their policies as something with geopolitical consequences. The new Moldovan authorities, pro-Western as they undoubtedly are, do not want to take part in a geopolitical contest between the West and Russia. Not only because of the constitutional neutrality of Moldova, that refers only to military neutrality, but the Moldovan authorities take public opinion into account. It is impossible for any party in Moldova to conduct an anti-Russia policy or a policy perceived as anti-Russia. That is out of tune with Moldovan public opinion. Moldova is unique in this respect. It differs from Ukraine, differs from Georgia. An anti-Russian electoral campaign and victory guarantees defeat, because a very large part of Moldova's population has genuine feelings of friendship, respect vis-à-vis Russia, or is outright pro-Russian, and another very large part, while not pro-Russian, still has feelings of respect vis-à-vis Russia and interest vis-à-vis Russia. Many Moldovan voters, even most Moldovan voters, I would say, expect any government of Moldova to take steps for certain level of economic cooperation with Russia, namely access to the Russian market for Moldovan agricultural products, a key issue. The legal status of Moldovan gastarbeiters in Russia, and of course, supplies of natural gas and electricity. Most Moldovan voters expect the government to be active in those respects and to bring results home. While it is true that a pro-Russia policy, such as the socialists and Igor Dodon, also does not guarantee victory in elections. On the contrary, it always guarantees defeat in elections. It is equally true that an anti-Russian policy is not feasible in Moldova. And Maia Sandu and her party PAS have correctly understood the situation. In their electoral campaign, which achieved a landslide, two landslides, parliamentary and presidential elections, they steered away from any anti-Russia messaging. They never criticized Russia for anything. They did not try to make analogies between the situation in Transnistria and the situation in Donbass. They did not adopt a pro-democracy platform. They did not in any way injure Russia's interest in Moldova. They focused, including on their foreign policy, on the interests of Moldova's citizens. What is your foreign policy? Our foreign policy is the interests of Moldova's citizens. Total geopoliticization of domestic politics and foreign policy, de-geopolitization. This made possible the landslides. Yet, the situation is fragile because both landslides, parliamentary and presidential, were achieved largely thanks to the vote of Moldova's diaspora in Europe. The situation is far more balanced internally. Internally, both the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections showed rather narrow victory margins for Maia Sandu and for PAS. The diaspora vote in the West makes a big difference. And so the situation in Moldova, the balance of forces, is rather reversible. It could be reversed in the event of a crisis, including an energy crisis, with its social consequences. So Moscow would like to undermine the position of the pro-Western government, including through the instrument of energy. It wants to undermine the standing of the government and of the president in the eyes of the voters by forcing them to confront an energy crisis. It wants to jeopardize the re-election of these new authorities for a second term of office. It wants to compel these authorities to focus on crisis management instead of focusing on the work for reforms. It wants to compel these authorities to shift funds from development and investment to paying for gas, to repaying the debts. It wants to block the unbundling and to preclude alternative supply sources for Moldova in the energy field, in all energy fields. This is Moscow's agenda, and it wants to use the current gas crisis, as we see in the protocol, as an instrument for continuing, reinforcing the exclusive dependence of Moldova on Russian gas and energy supplies, and even institutionalize it in the form of an intergovernmental agreement. Moscow does not want to overthrow these authorities. It wants to undermine them. All of this is very poorly understood in the West. The West has a, collectively, the West in a simplified way, collective West, has a very oversimplified understanding of what happened in Moldova. Pro-Russia versus pro-West, Moldova is pro-Western. No, it's far more complicated than this, as I tried to point out. The great success for Moldova in these elections is not only that it now has pro-Western authorities, it's more than this. It is the fact that for the first time in Moldova's, or almost the first time, in Moldova's independent history, there is unity at the level of the authorities. The presidency, the parliament, and the government are one team. They are a very reformist team, totally pro-Western in terms of values, but not in terms of geopolitics. Values, but not geopolitics. Committed to reforms. And de facto, we are headed, I hope, for a vertical of power. Vertical of power and unity of the ruling team at all branches of government is essential to advance reforms. Reforms will not be advanced in a situation of dispersed power, of rival branches of power, or coalition governments, which have to negotiate policies among the many component parties of the coalitions. Now we have an ideal situation, unity at all levels of the government team. We have one team in power. Russia would like to change this situation. It would like, as it always does, to have a coalition situation in which the Russians could manipulate some parties versus other parties, or play on divisions among these parties. This is why it is so important for this government to be re-elected in 2024-2025, because it needs 2 terms to rebuild the state. These new authorities have not inherited a state from the preceding authorities. They have inherited the ruins of a state. They must rebuild these ruins into a state. And for this, they need at least 2 consecutive terms of power. Russia would like to prevent this and is using the energy instruments in order to prevent this. And we have to support the Moldovan government to resist this blackmail. The outlook is not good. I don't expect Moldova to have diversified energy supplies for some years to come. There is this new gas interconnector from Romania, but Romania has no gas volumes available to put into this pipeline. Romania itself has mismanaged its own energy policy since previous governments, not the current government, the previous governments, the social democrat governments have mismanaged energy policy. Romania has no gas volumes to put into this new pipeline. Moldova needs direct access to a gas producer company, not to an intermediary. An intermediary would simply buy gas from a producer company, resell it to Moldova at a higher price. That cannot compete with Gazprom. Similarly, the electricity plant in Transnistria produces gas so cheaply on almost cost-free gas from Gazprom, that it can compete against any supplier. For example, Moldova in past years has tried to diversify the gas supplies with Akhmetov's DTK company from Ukraine. But the plant in Transnistria always outcompeted Akhmetov's electricity that he was willing to sell to Moldova. So alternative supplies of gas and electricity will not be forthcoming anytime soon. And we have to support Moldova to tide it over this difficult period and stiffen the Moldovan government's spine not to make concessions to Russia during this difficult transition period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vlad. This is a really interesting political explanation of what is happening in Moldova. Once Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream is already operational, but if Nord Stream 2 is certified and it starts operating, which I doubt is going to happen anytime soon, but in case it happens, the entire Central and Eastern European region are going to be squeezed between these two mega pipelines, like in a pincer movement. They are going to be an obstacle to development of regional gas market and accessing alternative gas suppliers and having pipelines with enough capacity to transfer this gas to Ukraine and Moldova. Do you expect that Moldova and Ukraine are going to have more trouble if these two pipelines are fully operational? Vlad and Frank, please. Frank, please answer this question.
I actually wanted to make that point. I think the faster Russia's attempt to fasten the certification, if that would happening in a way that the Nord Stream pipeline becomes operational already over the winter time, at a time when at the same time, despite increasing Russian gas supplies to European countries since the beginning of November, this will be only sufficient for a mild winter time. So if the winter becomes more severe, more colder than expected, then we may see some more trouble. And that has also to do with some other factors, actually, because we have a merger of the two gas market areas, Gazpool and NetConnect in Germany, which have not sufficient gas interconnectors in between. And with the rerouting of the Nord Stream pipeline becoming operational, where not so much gas is flowing from east to west, but rather from north to south, as well as from Turk Stream, from the south to the north, we may end up in a situation, according to some new analysis, where constraints and bottlenecks will still existing, at least in the winter time. Yeah, and that might be also another objective for the Russians to fasten or try to fasten the certification process. Although I do not believe that will actually be very successful. The certification, according to my information, may even last until May. Yeah, but at least there is a rationale on the Russian side beyond to have the certification being solved before a new German government can come in. But it also may lead to supply disruptions. And the most or the country which would be affected at most in this case would be actually Ukraine, which would then not be in the position over the winter time with only insufficient gas storage existing in Western Europe to have or the possibility to import 10 to 15 billion cubic meters a year. Particularly not over the time. And I think this kind of scenario should take more seriously because we do have some factors coming in which have not been anticipated as a combination of impacts creating due to the various changing circumstances. And so these circumstances have not been anticipated until very recently.
Yes, that's true. The Germany is delaying the process apparently of certification, and if certification ever happens, the best case scenario would be if the restrictions were imposed by the third energy package put in place for, as they are for OPAL, put in place for UGAL as well, so that a sufficient volume of gas is still going through Ukraine, and that way Ukraine can receive gas on the reverse from the European Union, Moldova as well. Mr. Putin has said in China 2 years ago that once Nord Stream 2 is operational, there won't be any more reverse flow to Ukraine. And whatever concerns Ukraine and Central Eastern European countries concerns Moldova as well. Vlad, Romania is buying a lot of gas from Turk Stream 2. Where does this gas go, and can it help Moldova at any point?
I don't follow Romania in detail. I do notice that Romania is rapidly increasing its gas imports from Gazprom. What Romania could do for Moldova is only resell volumes that it itself buys from Gazprom, and most likely resell it at a markup, not for a fraternal price, but at a markup. So there's no solution there. What this crisis dramatized is Moldova's lack of alternatives at the present time and in the next few years. Moldova bought a total of 17 million cubic meters of gas for an average price of $1,000 per 1,000 cubic meters, which is an astronomical price, not for consumption of, not to consume that gas, but simply to maintain a minimal pressure in the pipelines. So it was not gas for consumption. It was to maintain a certain level of pressures in the pipelines. This dramatizes the lack of alternatives. The European Union did offer $60 million to mitigate the social consequences of gas disruptions in Moldova, which is to say, to mitigate the cost to the Moldovan government of consumption to gas-consuming household, of compensation to gas-consuming households. But the European Union made clear that it would not cover the price difference in terms of gas supplies. In other words, it would not pay Gazprom for Moldovan gas consumption. The European Union made that clear. Now, with respect to compensation to the households, this is another very important aspect that needs to be better understood outside Moldova. This is understood in Moldova, but not outside Moldova. The new Moldovan authorities, totally pro-Western as they are, they do not propose economic neoliberalism. They stress their commitment to a social state, because this is what the Moldovan voters expect, a social state, heavy social expenditures on the part of the state. The reforms that the new authorities are advancing pertain to justice, investment climate, deregulation, demonopolization. Those are liberal reforms. But apart from that, it's the commitment to the social state. This is what the Moldovan voters expect, and this is partly why these new authorities won the elections. And they are delivering it. They are not, they are very sincere on it. They are delivering it. The Moldovan government has now enacted very generous compensations to household users of natural gas because of the higher price. And the compensation are blanket compensation, not limited to low-income households. They are applied to all households, regardless of their income. So this is another huge burden on the state budget and the shift of resources away from development. Even Western funding will be, to some extent, shifted away from development to social expenditures, including compensations for higher gas. Again, a politically motivated and, in my opinion, inevitable concessions in order to ensure a continuing stay in power, not for selfish party reasons, but because this is the only political force in Moldova that can really use a long time in office in order to rebuild the state. So this is where we are.
We have two questions here about renewable energy sources, development in Moldova from Vladimir Solonari and from Terian Hertli. Please, Sergiu, if you can talk about what is the participation, what is the share in the Moldovan energy mix at the moment, and what are the plans of the government for future renewable energy development, and how fast?
Currently, we have less than 2% of renewables in the energy mix, and the plans are to maybe bring it to 9–10% within the next 5 years. There are some legal aspects that should be reconsidered by the government, and we also intend to, together with some colleagues, to make some proposals. We need to adjust the market mechanism in order to speed up the investments in the renewables. There are some issues with the balancing mechanism with the market rules, which undermine the predictability of investments. So it's mostly about regulation. We don't need investments. We need to change the climate, to improve the climate of the business, and to let entrepreneurs invest in this business. However, we should bear in mind that renewables is not the final and the ultimate solution. We need, when you have sun and wind, it's fine, but there are periods even within the day when you have to rely on other sources. So we should keep in mind that we need to feed the base consumption. And some issues to add to the previous discussion. We should also keep in mind that these high prices on the spot market are a temporary issue. We see that already a number of countries that export LNG. So obviously, economy works in such a way that high prices bring in new players to increase the supply. And we've seen that United States, Qatar, Egypt, Australia, many other countries already announced even a double of LNG shipping within the next 4 years. So it's a temporary situation. And also, you've talked about the risks concerning the transit of gas through Ukraine. Now it's close to the level of 40–45 BCM per year. If the Nord Stream 2 will be operational, it's gonna operate on half of its capacity. So anyway, we speak about at least 10–15 BCM per year that will be still available for Ukrainian transit. So hopefully it won't stay without transit. And what I'm also maybe, what I consider an important thing that was achieved, we continue to deliver gas. I mean, the import of gas for Moldova goes through Ukraine. We didn't go for a Hungarian scenario when they shifted to Turk Stream. This is important for our bilateral relationship.
Yeah. Also, I think that if Nord Stream 2 is certified, it's not only going to operate at half of its capacity, but Nord Stream 1 is going to operate at less than 100% capacity, simply because right now Nord Stream 1 is using 2 pipelines in order to function at 100%. It's using UGAL, but OPAL, but it's also using UGAL. OPAL it can use at less than 100%, NEL at 100%, and UGAL is going to be at 50%, which may leave Ukraine with 40 to 45 BCM of transit. Still, that is going to be a good balance, but we are yet to see what is going to happen. Frank, you had a very interesting information in your slides, and I'm sorry I interrupted you because I was worried about time, but we will continue until 12:30. You said that Russian gas production is declining for various reasons. Can you elaborate on this?
The gas production itself is not declining as such. The problem is the present east-west supplies through Ukraine comes from the old gas fields, and the old gas fields are depleting. Yeah, the new gas fields operating at the very high level. Obviously, they can't be very much expanded, at least not in the short term. Yeah, and the old fields are depleting. At the same time, Russia was facing a situation that, firstly, its own gas demand over the last winter time as well as of the summertime was very much higher than in the years before. It has also increased its gas supplies to China as well as to Turkey. Yeah. The CEO Miller at the beginning of 2020 was still speaking that Russia has a spare capacity of 100 billion cubic meters, but which was also already disputed also by some other Russian expert at that time. Yeah. Now with the partly after the pandemic, and with the increasing demand in Europe, in China, in Turkey, etc., and decreasing production of the old gas fields, the spare capacity has certainly declined. There's a controversy to which extent the spare capacity has declined. My interpretation, it still has, if Russia has a political will, it still has a possibility to supply additional 15 billion cubic meters of gas, which would be needed, according to some estimates, to go through even a more severe winter time, and not just a mild winter time. And that was something which Putin deliberately was not supplying, because it created the linkages with the certification process, as well as a general criticism of the overall EU energy policies, and particularly the Green Deal, leading to a decrease of gas consumption already by the year 2030, and phasing out natural gas after 2030. That was lately discovered in Russia, but has now got the full attention. And so Putin was seeing the possibility not just to fasten the certification process of Nord Stream 2, but to criticize the overall EU energy policy, in hoping that some kind of changes will take place, that the gas consumption will not decrease, at least not by the year 2030.
Yes. Thank you. We have a question from Vlad Lupan, who says, having yearly contracts with Gazprom previously allowed Russia to have a leverage over Moldova ahead of the heating season. This year, the Gazprom signed an exceptional 5 years contract. Aside from the content of the protocol attachment, is there a danger that more concessions were made? So the addition to that question is that previously negotiations on the Transnistrian debt were secret. Hence, no minutes or protocols were published, but minutes do exist. And this is why he's asking the question. Who would like to address it?
Probably I'll address it.
Okay.
Well, actually, there was an attempt from Russia, at least from what I know. One attempt last year. It was quite disguised to pass the debt of Transnistria on Moldova's budget. It was hidden within the so-called Russian loan agreement. It was a support of Moscow for pro-Russian President Dodon, already former president, before the presidential campaign. It allowed Moldovan businesses to get loans in Russian banks under Russian state guarantees, and such loans would become Moldova's national debt. So actually, in this case, Moldova Gas could borrow some money, $7 billion in a Russian bank, and it might have become Moldova's debt. Well, basically, I think that this debt of the left bank is a weak point of Russia, because in any arbitration, Gazprom will lose definitely from a simple reason. This is a purely commercial debt between Gazprom and Moldova Gas. So normally, if one business doesn't pay its bills, the creditor comes and freezes the assets, sells them to get back the money. Now let's analyze. The overall gas debt is more than $8 billion, while the assets of Moldova Gas are less than 800 million, so less than 10% of the debt. And even those assets belong, so half of the shares of Moldova Gas already belong to Gazprom. So Gazprom knowingly continues to supply gas to Transnistria, being sure that they will never get their money back. And this is written constantly in their reports. So they have no economic interest. The interest is purely political. So that's gonna hurt them a lot. And I think we can use this vulnerability in negotiations with Russia to get rid of this debt and actually to write off the debt of the right bank, which, in my opinion, doesn't exist. Actually, Gazprom has some arrears to us. I don't think that Moldova accepted some additional concessions, especially mainly because Mr. Spârnu had no mandate to take some additional, obligations on behalf of Moldova. I don't think so. And referring to the third energy package, we should take into account that Moldova has the necessary infrastructure, so there is no problem in making some changes in the law on the natural gas and appoint an independent operator on the gas transmission system, if necessary. Again, if necessary. Okay, that's gonna spoil our relationship with the Russian side, but I don't think it's gonna be the case. And anyway, we'll still be dependent on the Russian gas until we don't construct the power lines with Romania. So the priority number one is to construct that power line that will interconnect us with the Romanian market. And in addition to that, what we need to do is to decrease the consumption. This is very, very important. And the district heating is the main energy efficiency direction we need to emphasize, because it not only will decrease the consumption of gas, but it will improve the quality of life of nearly 600,000 citizens in Chisinau and Belz. And from political side, this is also an efficient investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergio. Is there any last minute comment by our speakers, Vlad and Frank?
Yes, I would like to add, to agree with Sergio Tofilav that indeed the Moldovan government did not make any concessions in Moscow. Moscow wants to squeeze those concessions out of Chisinau in the months ahead, and this is what we must watch for. And we must always be mindful of the constraints, political constraints, under which the Moldovan government operates. The main foreign policy imperative regarding Russia, from Chisinau's point of view, is to have all quiet on the Russian front. All quiet on the Russian front in order to enable the government to focus on domestic reforms. That's why the government will continue to refrain from criticizing Russia, will smile to the Russians, is preparing a visit of the Prime Minister of Moldova to Moscow, with a prospective visit by Maia Sandu to Moscow. All these things will take place, and they should not be interpreted as deviating from the normative pro-Western orientation. It is the attempt or the effort to keep things quiet on the Russian front for at least 2 legislative terms to enable domestic state rebuilding.
Yeah, clearly, the new government needs time and space to implement its reforms uninterrupted and undisrupted by a geopolitical competition and by Russian subversion. Yes. The Russian subversion, therefore, may continue regardless of that, because any reform process in Russia's flanks is always undermined for the sake of keeping those neighbors within Russia's orbit and influence. Frank, any last words from you?
There's one factor I want to draw your attention a little bit, and that has a little bit to do what you have hinted in your points, Margarita, and that is if the full energy package will be adapted for the Nord Stream pipeline, then of course including also the third-party access. That means Russia can initially only use 50% of the Nord Stream pipeline capacity itself, and needs to open it to a third party. The Russian idea is to bring in here Rosneft. Rosneft will then fill and act as a third party and fill the other 50%. That might be accepted by the German Bundesnetzagentur, but I'm wondering what the positioning is for the certification process on the side of the European Commission. Remember, the entire energy package and the gas directive and the third-party access had been initially created and defined for the purpose for reducing the EU's dependence on Gazprom and Russia, not just Gazprom. So the question is whether the European Commission will accept Rosneft as a third party. And I think for the Commission, it might be easier to accept rather Novatek, which is at least formally or officially not a state-owned company. Yeah, Rosneft is a state-owned company. So even in this respect, formally there is a difference. But it also creates the question, by accepting Rosneft, yeah, whether that would not contradict the ghost, so to speak, the ghost of the third-party access, yeah, the original purpose and objective. So in this respect, that could be also a very interesting question, and which would also have impacts, yeah, on the supply situation and the potential constraints and bottlenecks within Central European countries and Ukraine, and how much gas is then available on the European market.
This is a very good point. In addition to that, the legislation was created to EU right to limit Russia. So the gas is coming from the same sources, from the state-controlled gas fields in Siberia. It's not a different source. One thing I would like to close by saying, I think it's very important for European politicians to realize that with the environmental danger that Russian gas and oil production creates through the release of excessive methane emissions to the atmosphere that are becoming CO2 after 2-3 years, and are 80% actually more potent than any other CO2 sources, the more Europe depends on Russian gas. As Frank, you pointed out in your presentation, 53% of the import, the more Europe is undermining its climate change agenda. Russian gas is extremely dirty. It's the dirtiest in the world. Russia is responsible for 20% of global methane gas emissions, which are visible from the atmosphere. And Russia is not recognizing that fact and not doing anything to curtail the situation, to reduce those gas emissions. So the more we buy Russian gas, the more we are dooming our planet for more trouble in the future and more environmental damage and more potentially climate change and undermining the goals of both the United States and the European Union. And I want to thank all of our panelists today for such an excellent discussion. And I hope we're going to gather together again soon for another interesting panel. Thank you.
Okay. All the best to Washington.
All the best to you.
All the best, Vladimir.
Yeah. Thank you. Stay